Morning. Thanks for coming to our EDUcast this morning. I am lucky enough to have Matt Difanis as my guest today. Matt's an active realtor, owner in Champaign County, and has a very successful team. He is an enormous supporter of education. I see him at a lot of the places I'm looking at education. Past president of Illinois Realtors and past president of Champaign Association of Realtors, and a major RPAC investor. I have been very lucky to see Matt. Well, first I'm going to tell you, besides that, he is also a talented podcaster, and he's been doing podcasts before we've all started podcasting, so he's ahead of the curve. He has beautiful, and a photographer, I see him taking pictures, and his pictures are beautiful. And he has just acquired a new dog, and that new dog did something really interesting lately, didn't it, Matt?
Yes, so I have two Irish setters, the younger of whom is a 7-month-old puppy, and officially this one, having owned dogs my whole life, made the most expensive chew toy of my lifetime when he chewed the front bumper cover of my car, which got some interesting looks when I went to the body shop and they asked, the nature of the damage. They looked up when I said my dog ate my bumper.
I've had a lot of dogs in my life too, and I have to tell you, that one takes the cake for all the damage my dogs have done as well.
You're welcome. Glad to take one for the team, Deborah.
Take one for the team. The first time that I saw Matt speak really in a serious way, I was at a meeting at John Marshall Law School, and it was put on by the Department of Human Rights, and they were talking about reasonable accommodations and modifications, a guide for the housing professional. And it was a really interesting meeting as they were talking about it. And then Matt got up to speak. And this must have been, Matt, don't you think, almost 2 years ago?
Oh yeah, it was spring probably of 2018, because that was the year I was Illinois Realtors president.
And the interesting thing was, I was so surprised by what he said that it stayed in my mind, and that's really why I invited you today, because I heard you speak that day. So welcome to the EDUcast, and my first question for you is sort of like a sad song that I'm going to be singing. I've been teaching fair housing now for over almost 25 years. Every class, every time I have class, every single time we do it, I've been talking about fair housing. And yet Newsday just did an investigation that discovered we're still doing the same old crummy stuff. What was your response to that survey, Matt, the Newsday survey?
Yeah, so for those of you who maybe haven't seen it, Newsday did a fair housing expose profiling the experience of a bunch of testers that they deployed in Long Island, New York. And it was very well documented, both in print and in multimedia, hidden camera, and then also some debrief interviews with the testers. And it's all been taken out from behind the paywall so anyone can see it. So first of all, if you're a realtor and you haven't seen it, spend some time on it. It was devastating because the year that I got the honor of serving as Illinois Realtors president was 2018, which corresponded with the 50-year commemoration of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And so by happenstance, the year I was in that role happened to coincide with a lot of commemorative activities. And so that was part of what got me sensitized to it. But it's just devastating when you realize that the trade organization and the Code of Ethics in particular, and I also happen to be the 2020 NAR Pro Standards chair, so my committee is the keepers of the code. We've been so good on fair housing in modern history after having been on the wrong side of the issue decades ago. And to see that was just such a devastating indictment of the industry and just how short we're falling of our own standards. I mean, to say nothing of the legal bar, but our own standards, the Code of Ethics. So it was really devastating. Now, what we'll talk about a little bit is, a big part of it, I think, links to the very current topical conversation about implicit bias. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but I think in many cases, the realtors, if any of us read the transcript of the conversations, any of us who have sat through a fair housing class, which is all of us, we have to keep our licenses, you'd read that and think, oh my gosh, I mean, that's not a subtle case study. That's way over the line. And yet I'm fairly certain that most of the practitioners who made those statements had no ill intent and probably weren't even aware of the differential treatment.
And I would agree with you. That was probably the saddest part of that whole survey. So NAR, I have to say, was pretty responsive pretty quickly. Can you talk about some of the things NAR's put in place when they saw that? So they just didn't go, oh, ho, hum, we're so sad. They did some real serious stuff.
Yeah, I mean, people now, kind of recognize talk is cheap. And so NAR and specifically current President Vince Malta were very swift to indicate that they took that seriously, that it was very troubling, and then pledged to do better. And then, of course, that would ring pretty hollow if they didn't actually take some quick action to do better. So let's see, that was back in maybe November. By January, NAR had actually undertaken some meaningful restructuring, which has included bifurcating the diversity committee and parsing out a separate fair housing committee. And NAR hired Brian Green to be the director of fair housing. And Brian Green was hired right out of HUD. I had heard him speak at an event in Chicago in his capacity as a HUD official just a couple of years ago. So they hired a legit expert who is steeped in fair housing to deal with those issues. And then NAR announced their ACT initiative, which stands for Accountability, Culture, and Training. And on the training front, we'll talk a little more about some of the new implicit bias resources, because I feel like that's where we as practitioners, we as trainers, and you're in my case, Deborah, have some legit new resources. So it's not just rehashing the same old fair housing vocabulary, which has been drilled into people's heads forever now.
One of the things that when I heard you speak, Matt, you spoke a little bit about the history of how, about NAR's history as it pertained to fair housing. And certainly here in Chicago, I know that you're from Champaign, but here in Chicago, we've had issues. That's the nicest way I could say. We've had issues. Can you talk a little bit, well, more than issues, we've had some bad troubles. Can you talk a little bit about some of the history and how NAR has gotten to the place they are today?
Sure. So the NAR has existed. Its advocacy efforts have historically been to protect private property rights, and they still are. And I referenced the trade organization being on the wrong side of fair housing, because back in the 50s and 60s, when fair housing was becoming a hotly debated public policy topic, the position of the trade organization at that time was that fair housing mandates amounted to forced housing mandates, and that it unreasonably impinged upon private property rights, i.e., I should be able to sell or not sell to whoever I dang well please. And in fact, if you go back even farther into the early 20th century, you had a code of ethics from an early version of the code of ethics that had a mandate, an ethical mandate that realtors shall not introduce populations, ethnicities, groups into a neighborhood that would be deemed injurious to the values of the properties, i.e., there was an ethical mandate to be anti-fair housing. And so, moreover, you look at a city like Chicago, which is to this day one of the most segregated major cities in the country. And the reality is that those color lines in the city of Chicago that persist to this day very, very closely tie to the Homeowners Loan Corporation redlining maps from the 1930s and 40s. So we're not talking ancient history. We're talking, in the time frame that our parents and grandparents were alive. And if you were Black, you were absolutely shut out of any kind of mainstream financing. So the city of Chicago has some infamous examples that's usually my go-to, but recognizing my NSBAR audience, I want to showcase one shot that we'll bring up now, and that is showing one of the redlining maps from that era. And I'm going to read you just a small passage of the margin notes. And these maps, while they were promulgated by a federal government agency, the maps and the comments were actually produced by realtors and appraisers. So, our industry's fingerprints are on them. So you see this red-lined area, and it's the only red-lined area in that northern suburban area because that was the Black ghetto for all the people that worked in expensive neighborhoods in the North Shore area. So the margin notes, and these are exact quotes. This neighborhood houses the large Negro population living in Evanston. It's somewhat better than the average Negro district in that the bulk of the houses are one family detached in anything but a congested district for this class. In other words, most of the Black population was forced into slums that had ungodly amounts of density. So this was a little less bad than most. Here live the servants for many of the families all along the North Shore. Not a vacant house. Occupancy is about 150%. Because even though it was relatively low density, you typically had multiple families jammed into it. I'm skipping down. This concentration of Negroes in Evanston is quite a serious problem for the town, as they seem to be growing steadily and encroaching into adjoining neighborhoods. The federal government with the assistance of realtors and appraisers, was writing about our Black brothers and sisters as though they were worse than an infestation of rodents. And I've been in the business for 22 years, and fair housing was a vocabulary and an ancient history lesson, not a living history lesson, not anything that was tied to today. And so what really helped change my outlook on it, when I had occasion by happenstance to be somewhat steeped in this history, the year I was serving as Illinois Realtors president, is realizing just how durable these red lines have been, because you can still trace a lot of our segregated housing patterns to something that has been illegal now for 52 years.
What changed then, Matt? What changed the National Association of Realtors? What changed their mind? What started them down a better path?
Well, I mean, for one thing, the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968, understand that the legislative will to pass that had been an ongoing public policy debate, but the legislative will to actually get that done was literally in the very few days following Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. And at that point, that provided just enough momentum to get it over the finish line. So then it became the law of the land. And not too long thereafter, the Realtor Trade Organization got in line with what was then the law of the land. And then, quite interestingly, given that our forebears had been lobbying against all of this, you fast forward to 2013, when our code of ethics had already for decades had a fair housing article, so making an ethical mandate to promote and protect fair housing, the National Association of Realtors added sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes back in 2013 and 2014. And think about that, gender identity in particular. We still have many, many jurisdictions in the country where that is not a protected class. There was a Supreme Court decision in the last couple of weeks, but that was very specific to you can't fire people. So, I mean, we're talking something that's still an unprotected class in vast swaths of our country. And the trade organization happily not only got onto the right side of the issue, but then found itself on the leading edge, the tip of the spear, fighting to make sure that these other classes helped ensure that people couldn't be denied access to housing or equal service by realtors on the basis of who they are.
They've moved forward. And even after we've had some of the demonstrations and all those things, they must have been preparing this before the demonstration occurred because of the actions they took right in the beginning of the year. But talk a little bit about this unintended discrimination, how they've just published a really cool webinar, whatever piece about all of this. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, if you're watching, if you have a visual, you may be able to detect that I'm a white guy, and I have been my entire life. So one of the things that's so interesting is, as we end up with this political polarization, and as we're ending up with a lot of societal and civil unrest, white people in general don't like being called or implied that they're racist. And one of the most interesting things about it, because obviously there are a few fringe people that are proudly flying the stars and bars and going to white supremacist rallies, but obviously that's, so when white people get called that, they're thinking that's not who I am, so that's very offensive to me because I don't have a racist bone in my body. And what the NAR implicit bias resources are pointing out is that is generally true. People who truly don't have any racial prejudice, certainly no conscious racial prejudice, still everybody, not just white people, literally everybody has in their brain programmed shortcuts that help us navigate all sorts of daily living tasks so that we're not paralyzed having to hyper analyze every situation we find ourselves in. And the whole idea behind implicit bias is that when you're taking some of these testing tools, you're able to identify some of the ways your brain, my brain, is pre-wired. And I'll give you a very interesting example. I am the only white person in my own house. My wife is a Filipino immigrant, so I'm married to a brown person. Her parents have lived with me for years. My children are, as they would say, beige. So I'm the only white person in my own house. And yet when I've taken multiple ones of these implicit bias testing instruments, one that compared preference for or against white/European against black/African, and a different one where the facial features were identical and it was just light skin, dark skin. In both cases, in multiple iterations, I tested with an implicit bias against dark-skinned and separately against African American. That's significant because I've developed a reputation as a fair housing activist. I have gotten very accustomed to being the only white person in a lot of rooms in the south side of Chicago, and in some cases, the last white person I saw for the last couple miles of the drive. So I say that to make the point that I certainly would not believe that I am overtly prejudiced. I don't harbor any racial prejudice in my conscious mind, but the tools that NAR has now deployed and the video that explains it is so important because it helps me become aware of where my own brain is going to make a shortcut. And what I would tell you as an example, because people say, well, I don't see color. I was raised not to see color. Well, let me just tell you, if you're a white person, just imagine yourself in the heart of the Black community after dark, walking down a sidewalk where 12 pedestrians pass you going the opposite directions. They're coming at you. And you can't tell me that your brain isn't noticing color and factoring that into a threat assessment. And I'm not saying that makes you or makes me racist. It just is disingenuous to assert that you don't see color, because you do, and you may see it on a subconscious level. So the NAR tools are so important because they give us a free opportunity to get a little education, not only on where our individual shortcuts are pre-wired, but then the video that they've made available, which is specific for the realtor population, then offers actual real-world tips for how it is that you can override the bias, how you can force your brain when you're in those situations where you're liable to take one of those shortcuts in a way that could result in one of those Newsday expose-like unintended differential treatment moments where you can essentially force your brain into a manual override and take some pretty easy actions to prevent it. That's huge. I would say in the last 6 months, that's the resource that if I could force everyone who's a realtor into ingesting it, that's what I would say you need to spend an hour doing.
It was really interesting. I just taught a class and we stole an hour from something else we were doing, and I had the people in the class watch the video. The responses were amazing. Number one, I was surprised because it's an hour-long video, and people, when you ask them to watch an hour-long video, I thought they were going to go, this was too long.
Strains our 20/20 attention span.
It certainly does. And instead they said, oh, it went by so quickly. Oh, I never thought of that. Oh, so I was heartened, if I would have to say, by the response that I got to the realtors who were watching that. My next question is, it's okay, now we've understood this, but as the real estate community, we've got work to do. That's on the national level, they're doing that. What do we need to be doing here on the local level, Matt?
Well, let me talk briefly about the national level. So, you know, I'm the chair of the Professional Standards Committee. We are convening a special meeting next week to specifically talk race and then to look at whether, and if so, to what extent the Code of Ethics should apply to things like racist statements made by realtor members, even if it's not directly within the context of a transaction. Obviously, at the NAR Pro Standards level, any changes or guidance made there has uniform national application. At the local level, it varies so much because so much of this societal unrest has intersected with the time when literally our doors have been locked and we've got a lot of our staff that are decentralized working from home. So it's not like we can have an organized event. But what I would say in terms of practical tips, challenge yourself. As I said, I've been a white person all of my life, and I have been forced, thankfully, into re-examining a lot of things that I had taken for granted. And I've gotten to see things just through my unexpected life experiences the last 2 years that I can't unsee. They've changed my perspective and I can't unsee them. And so right now I would say, if you're in the white majority, white establishment, it is not enough to merely say in your own mind, I am not prejudiced, I'm not bigoted, I'm not racist. It's really a moral imperative right now to back that up with actions and to look at it as, what can I do to actually be part of being an anti-racist movement? Because when you look at that implicit bias writ large within an organization, and again, none of this is the result of ill will or any evil intent at all, but you look at the implicit biases that are hardwired into every one of our brains, and then you look at collective groups of people, and then you look at the institutional results writ large, and we do end up creating unwittingly these glass ceilings or this institutional bias or institutional racism, which then if you're in the white establishment, you feel like, well, they're calling me a racist. No, you just have to understand how when you combine that at the collective. And so my suggestion is look for ways to be proactively anti-racist.
You remind me of the nuns that I went to grammar school with that said, you need to examine your conscience. You need to examine your conscience all the time.
If I had a nickel for every time I'd been told that, I would just have my first nickel.
Yeah, that's what it was. You need to examine your heart. You need to examine your conscience. That's really what they're talking about, is something as simple as that. Except
the problem is, it's not a conscience issue because it's all subconscious. That's what makes it so insidious. So, you can examine your own heart and think, I don't have a racist bone in my body, and be sincere and truthful about it. And it doesn't mean that you couldn't have, or I couldn't have just as easily been one of those people where when you read the quotes in the Newsday article, you think, oh my gosh. And for an educator like you, it would give you palpitations. And it's really, it could happen so easily to any of us, even if we are not consciously prejudiced.
Then I think at the local level, we're going to have to just really, really, really focus on awareness. This is just going to need to be the top of mind of the awareness in what we're training, in our teaching, in the meetings that we have, in the decisions that we're making. It's just going to have to stay top of the mind awareness.
I'm going to tell you part of what ended up being so monumentally transformative for me. And I didn't operate from a playbook. Becoming a champion of improved inclusion was not on my radar when I was coming through the chairs at Illinois Realtors. It's just something that by happenstance ended up becoming a real passion and an ongoing passion and obsession. But for me, in the real estate universe, as a percentage of total membership nationally, but at most of our local levels, you look at how overwhelmingly white our membership is. And therefore, you look at how overwhelmingly white a typical board of directors is, or a committee is going to be. And depending on where your geography is, there aren't going to be a lot of members of color that you could invite in. One of the most transformative things for me was having opportunities, in many cases seeking them out, to go spend time in the heart of the Black community. I will forever be a better and different person because of the hospitality and grace that at the time, a representative of one of the organizations that had such a troubling history of discrimination, and yet the grace and the hospitality I have been shown every time I have been in the Black community has been both inspirational, but also nothing short of life-changing. And I'm not gonna lie, the first couple of times that I went to events, and all I knew, especially as somebody from a different part of the state, is I hear that neighborhood named with a gunshot event or the most recent murder. Or in one case, my good friend's son who was shot and left to die in a dark parking lot. All I knew about some of these locations is people get killed here for no reason. And as a white guy, that's terrifying. And it's why you have so many white people that literally wouldn't be caught dead in some of those neighborhoods. So I'm not saying there wasn't trepidation the first time I made a point of going to some areas that are outside my literal geographic and also metaphorical comfort zone. But man, you think about being the outlier. And that's what our members of color feel like every time they show up at a board meeting or a committee meeting, when they are the outlier. And the recurring theme I hear from so many of my friends is, oh yeah, I'm the only one. I was the first, I was the only, I am still the only. And so it's a good thing for people that don't think of themselves as white establishment or white privilege recipients to be in that role reversal where they are the outlier, where everybody can see from a mile away, you aren't from around here. And yet I've been welcomed with open arms consistently, and it has been life-changing. Matt,
we're getting to the end of the half an hour we're going to spend together. One of the things that I've noticed about you, because I've been stealing your YouTube videos to use in class for a while now, is you're using technology to get messages across, widely across, to more than just, and I know that you talk to your team, you talk to your company, but you're trying to get across a larger message. Why is it that's your job? Why is that your job?
Well, are we talking fair housing? Are we talking sort of the stuff I like to preach about? Or are we talking my business podcast? What are we talking about?
Let's talk about fair housing. Why is that your job?
It's a moral imperative. You know, I'm no longer on the Illinois Realtors leadership team. I have no official role other than an at-large board member. I don't speak for that organization. But I have been permanently reshaped by the experiences that I was lucky enough to have. And so many of the things, if I think back to some of the most formative experiences in my life, so many of those were things I would never have seen coming. And if you're an obsessive planner, they're things you can't plan for. And so much of the things that have been most permanently and meaningfully transformative were things that occurred by happenstance, where I simply had to be open and willing. And in many cases, it all started with being willing to show up, being willing to, and I've developed a reputation for be careful what you invite Matt to, because he's willing to drive almost anywhere and show up at almost anything if it's a cause that he believes in.
Your ability to be involved with NAR, your commitment to NAR, to Illinois Realtors, to your own local association, how has that tied into what you're talking about here? It's given you a platform in some ways, but did it help you to be able to get up on the platform that you were the president of Illinois Realtors? How did that, if I was coming into real estate right now, how would being a member of an association help me to be better at what I'm doing? How did it help you?
Well, I mean, I'll turn it into a Deborah commercial. The training resources that the association brings are invaluable, truly invaluable. And then secondly, if you're looking for opportunities, one of the things I said in my inaugural speech in October of 2017 is, if you look like me, go find a group that caters to people who don't look like you and show up. And that's hugely educational. And of course, as every facet of our population and our client base is becoming more and more diverse, and my own household's a microcosm of that, the more time you spend around people from different backgrounds and who look different from you, the less tension there is. And that goes back to something that's in the NAR video. If we get into a pattern of positive interactions with people from different backgrounds and who don't look like us, a lot of the tension just organically melts away, and we're just better at everything. We learn more from other people, other perspectives. We objectively make better decisions. And so many of the tense things in life right now just on their own kind of tend to melt away.
Matt,
but it's a moral imperative. That's why it continues spreading the word. I view it as a moral imperative.
That would be the nuns again speaking to me, Matt.
Right.
So you know, that would be that. Matt, I want to thank you. You have been absolutely wonderful to have you speak today. I can't tell you how much this means to us. We are, as an association, as human beings, as members of other groups besides even being realtor groups, trying to sort our way through how to deal with this. And I think you've given us some great ideas of things we should do today.
Thank you so very much for the invitation,
Thank you so much. I
Deborah.
appreciate you being here very much.
I love my NSBAR colleagues, and I so appreciate the invitation. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Bye-bye.